for waiting. There was some hiccups with the technology. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm Amrita Ghosh, and I'm going to talk about the dialectic of gendered protests in 21st century India. And I'm going to focus on the Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, and the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir from August 2019. And why I choose these two events are because they're so close together first. And how I'm going to space out the whole talk is first I'm going to focus on the Shaheenbagh protests, then turn to Kashmir, what immediately happened after the revocation of Article 370, and focus on the representation of gender, the protest by women, resistance, and the categories, different categories of resistance and agency that are manifested through these two events. And towards the end, I will connect the dots and explain why I call it the dialectic of gendered protest and what it implies for 21st century India. And I'm hoping I will try to fill in very brief descriptions or explanations of these two events, but I'm hoping that we all know about these that have been in the news for such a long time. The Shaheenbagh protest began quickly after the mid-December announcement of the CAA, or the Citizenship Amendment Act, that was passed by the Indian Parliament in December. Shaheenbagh is located at an interesting junction that bridges a posh and opulent South Delhi. It is busy. It is dominantly a Muslim working class section of Delhi. Women of Shaheenbagh, mostly Muslim, of different ages, as old as 82, and then young students, homemakers, protested for over 100 days in what is called the sit-in dharna, sit-in protests against the CAA and the NRC, the NRC being the National Registry of Citizenship, where people have to provide documents for legitimizing their citizenship of India. And we can talk about how that is problematic in many ways too. And Citizenship Amendment Act is obviously the one that says that undocumented refugees or people from Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan can have space or can live, Indian citizenship can be provided for them, only who are not Muslim. Interestingly, many of the Shaheenbagh women who came out to protest had witnessed the partition, and this event became a reminder to them of the partition subcontinent. And they said that they didn't want to have another breaking up of the country. The Shaheenbagh protests are also worthy of attention in many layered ways. The demographic of women were from all age groups, as I just mentioned. Not just students, but homemakers, grandmothers, and this kind of had garnered a certain narrative that dadis of Shaheenbagh, the grandmothers of Shaheenbagh, it gained a certain currency in the political fabric. Mostly the women near this East Delhi Okhla area have lived quiet, guarded lives without much of a political participation. Since mid-December, they came out in crowds and hordes, braving the Delhi winter on the streets, protesting against these two laws with messages, poems, placards, posters. Media coverage on New Year's Eve showed women in large numbers of all ages, some with young children, and babies singing the national anthem and chanting against the laws, demanding answers from the government. So the women representing this kind of protest were not by regularly understood definition activists. In most interviews, the women have said that they have never had any kind of participation politically before, let alone come out on the streets on nights in Delhi. Many are homemakers, mothers, and in their 70s or 80s, they sat there on the roads days on demanding answers. I'm quoting here 82-year-old Bilkis, who had been camping for over a month. In my whole life, this is the first time I have taken part in any political movement, she said. Quoting again, before this, I was a housewife. I never left the house. Now I eat here and sleep here. I go back home just every couple of days to get new clothes. It is cold sometimes, but it is not difficult. How can I sit by knowing that my children might be thrown out of this country, which is their home, and made to go to prison or sent to Pakistan? I will only leave this place when my children's lives are safe. We are powerful and Modi is now afraid, end quote. So this event, this movement emerged in a way that emphasized Muslim women's political subjectivity in pronounced ways. It is also a movement that isn't framed dominantly by just women's issues. Like, for example, obviously we have seen women coming out in massive numbers for the very infamous rape case, Jyoti Singh, that happened. Also the Me Too movement. But not that they're not important, but this is a different kind of mobilization that we saw from December onwards. What is also stark in this protest movement is that it was clear that the CAA was doubly exclusionary for women, putting marginalized women in a kind of a double erasure from the patriarchal state, and then because they were minority. Women in India, women from marginalized communities mainly, have little documentation to prove, or almost none, to prove their existence as citizens. I'm quoting an article by Shaheenbagh Lahiri, who states, and I quote, "In a nation like India, where the process of decolonization is hardly over, the national identity of women emerged out of the construction of history of its struggles against the colonial and the post-colonial government. And hence the threat to lose the right to vote or to get citizenship nullified makes a deep impact," end quote. Soon we saw the Shaheenbagh protest trickle into the other parts of India, in Park Circus, Calcutta, Sabzi Bagh, Shanti Bagh in Bihar, Lucknow, and Kerala. Newspaper reports and social media was abuzz saying Shaheenbagh is everywhere. There was another layer to this movement where it saw a manifestation in arts and popular culture. The Shaheenbagh protest gave rise to interesting period art and popularization of the meme culture. The protests have taken iconic art and fused them into the present moment. Amrita Ghosh's famous painting, and I'm sorry I cannot show this. I thought we would be meeting in person, so I would have shown you artwork and how this particular meme and artwork became popularized. So Amrita Ghosh, the famous painter, her artwork, Three Girls, from 1935, was fused into the image of sisterhood of three women from Shaheenbagh huddled together into real current dynamic moment. Historically too, the movement was compared to Jallianwala Bagh. Some slogans and quotes coming out from protests said they were not going to go down just like the brutal killings by the British. So in a way, this movement overturned that historical moment, claiming the resistance into the symbol of Shaheenbagh. The use of flags, tricolors, were also upturned from the usual association of jingoistic nationalism and Hindutva, and the Muslim women were draping them as head covers, claiming the nation and belonging towards their own. Rajvi Desai, in an article, states, and she interviews many of these women and talks about their voices, quoting one of them, "We are housewives," says one of the first Shaheenbagh women, Taranam Begum, 45, whose children are Jamia students. "Before this, we cooked rotis at home and took care of our children. But today, we are here to fight for the rights of our children, the rights of our families, and for the rights of fellow women sitting there." In Shaheenbagh, Begum says, "Nobody's a leader and nobody's a politician. We went alley to alley chanting, 'Apne gharo se bahar niklo, abhi nahi to kabhi nahi.' Come out of your homes, if not now, then never." They came out in hundreds, then thousands, bearing food, water, tea, medical supplies. You can see the revolution that it has become today, Begum adds, scanning the crowd in pride, constantly looking for protesters and guests who might need to be taken care of. Before I move on to the Kashmir section, I will have one more quote by Zarqa Qadri, who came out also to protest on New Year's Eve with her one-year-old child. I'm quoting journalist Ankita Johri, who interviewed her. Begin quote, "She was out with a thick jacket over her burqa, her head sheathed in a suede scarf, her child swaddled in a fleece blanket. She has left her older child home in his aunt's care." A housewife and former student of Jamia Millia Islamia, Qadri wouldn't ordinarily be out at this hour. But recently, she says, she has been consumed by both anger and fear. "I don't want to be put into a detention camp. I don't want my children to be jailed. Hame kaid kiya ja raha hai. We are being shackled. Women have to raise their voices. We will be the worst affected," she adds, disappearing into the sea of people. And I'm going to explain how this, the representation and this movement had a larger impact on the socio-political fabric as I finish with the second part, that is Kashmir, and the different manifestation of resistance and movement, protest movement in Kashmir. So now I go back 6 months before, in August 2019, when Article 370 was revoked. Now, what is Article 370? Very quickly, the conflict of Kashmir goes back to the partition. At that time, in 1947, the then Hindu king Maharaja Hari Singh wanted to remain independent, but with the threat of violence from post-partition from the other side of the border, he sought help from the Indian government and acceded Kashmir to India. But the accession was conditional. It was not to be permanent. And after Maharaja Hari Singh's declaration of the accession, Kashmir's representatives then negotiated with the Indian government to include Article 370 into the constitution, where Kashmir was to retain autonomy in all matters, except for currency, defense, and foreign affairs. It also could have a separate flag and a constitution. So with the revocation of Article 370, whatever autonomy was left for Kashmir was taken away. And also that conditional accession was based on a plebiscite during and after partition, which never really took place. The people's voices were never really heard. So we find ourselves in a moment in August 2019 when Article 370 was revoked, and then came a sudden curfew on Kashmir with political leaders under house arrest, people's lives completely stranded, 35,000 military troops planted, and a complete telecommunication breakdown. In the aftermath of this, I want to focus on women of Kashmir in the conflict zone, and then to rethink the concepts of protest, resistance, and how we see differently in comparison to the Shaheenbagh protests. The revocation of Article 370 brought back a certain narrative of violence against Kashmiri women and fetishizing the women, and that had its roots in the past. Next, we think about how to look at the everydayness of Kashmiri women, and I use the term infra-politics, I'm going to talk about that later again, of Kashmiri women's life and how that is important to locate this kind of resistance and protest. And finally, the larger question, what constitutes the largest protest of the Muslim women and what it says about the discourses of protest and gender. And that's how I will end the section. As soon as this abrogation of Article 370 happened, this got couched in a certain narrative that said that it was for the better and betterment of Kashmir and Kashmir's women. And there was a misogynist area of voices that started saying that this is about saving Kashmiri women. A certain legislator said, and I'm quoting him here, "Now BJP workers could marry fair-skinned Kashmiri women and buy plots of land," end quote. Another said, let's bring brides from Kashmir," end quote. It is, of course, a painful reminder of gendering discourse where women and land are conflated to be claimed. Similar discourses about claiming women's bodies go back to partition violence, when women's bodies and honor became transferred into the idea of the nation and community. In times of war and conflict, it is women who become the currencies of conflict, and unfortunately, Kashmiri women also became the most vulnerable subjects immediately in the aftermath of Article 370's abrogation. The idea of saving Kashmiri women also has its roots back into the Bollywoodization of Kashmir, the stereotypical portrayal of land, its exotic people, beautiful landscapes. Kashmiri women in mainstream popular culture have been objectified through their beauty and as desirable objects. They have been represented as the other in various filmic depictions, and there's been these plethora of films that do so. But I want to locate a moment of popular culture immediately 2 months after the incident of Article 370 happened in August. On October 2nd, as the complete telecommunication blackout was still going on, a very upscale designer brand in mainstream India, Raw Mango, it markets ethnic clothing in India, they released a new clothing campaign called Zuni on its various social media channels. The campaign statement said, and I'm quoting, "Because Kashmir is about its people, which needs to be seen and heard." That was their campaign statement. As the campaign went live, many commented underneath these pictures inquiring about the prices of these items and how beautiful they were. And many non-Kashmiri people, of course, Kashmiri people did not even have their voices under a complete blackout. Many started protesting about the timeliness of this campaign. Why this campaign is important at this time is because it also underscores what kinds of visual representation of women gain a certain kind of currency in a certain culture of silence, which is this complete silence from a large population in India as it was going on. The campaign also rehashed the same fetish of Kashmiri women. It said, because Kashmir is about its people, which needs to be seen and heard, yet the kind of seeing and hearing was absent. Who was seeing and who was hearing was only non-Kashmiri people. By 2 a.m. that night, when the campaign had gone live that day, because of the protests underneath the campaign, in comments, the images had vanished. Raw Mango had issued a public defense, not really an apology that they were removing the campaign images due to public sentiment, but there was an assumption of intent by the people who had protested. They said that, we really were not doing any harm. Couple of quick descriptions of the images of women in these campaigns. Women were dressed as a bride. A central figure of the woman has her eyes lowered in a veil, adorned in stunning traditional clothing, and the campaign named Zuni is plastered across her face, a key metonymic suggestion that she's really not a subject here, she's an object. Her face is barely visible, but remains as an adorning background to enhance the campaign title. She's surrounded by other Kashmiri women whose faces are hazy, not really visible. Mainly the bodies and arms are visible. They're silent, empty of subjectivity, and the campaign comes at a time of crisis when 2 months of total blackout of communication had already silenced Kashmiris. The Zuni campaign wasn't seen or accessed by Kashmiris, thus saving the culture and grandeur of Kashmiri was not for Kashmiris in the first place. Seema Kazi, who has worked extensively on the legal and gender intersections in Kashmir, explains the sexual violence and the device it has towards control and fear on Kashmiri women. And there has been a lot of work on this, and anthropologist Atharsia also says that this is a key device to have this kind of fear, the sexual violence, or the suggestions of it. And for the same reason, women find it hard to report any sexual violence, and statistics are largely unreliable. The very infamous case of Kunan Pushpora in 1991 is still hanging to find justice. The two villages of Kunan and Pushpora witnessed mass rapes by Indian Army forces, and the numbers are debated somewhere between hundreds. And some had come forward to report the violence and seek justice. The case is still inconclusive in the court, as the Indian Army has always denied any allegations of the incident. In 1992, the US report on international human rights concluded that there was credible evidence that against a mass sexual violence against women in Kunan Pushpora. It is still the largest mass gender violence in independent India. Haley Dushinsky and Atharsia's extensive work on half-widows and disappeared people in Kashmir also sheds light on women in the conflict zone of Kashmir. The term half-widow denotes those women whose husbands are missing, disappeared in the conflict, and no finality has come to the family, or especially the woman, to proclaim them as a deceased person, because there exist no records of this person at all. Since 1989, when militancy peaked in Kashmir, and it also led to this mass exile of the Pandit Hindu community in Kashmir, human rights organizations have tracked roughly 70,000 people killed and more than 80,000 forced disappearances in Kashmir. And this is a study done by Haley Dushinsky. Under the Indian penal system, for an investigation to even begin, the report to be lodged or registered, it has to be at least a long, arduous process, 7 years. Otherwise, the report cannot be even registered. So if there are no FIRs, or the first information reports, there are no missing or disappeared people. Also, there's this interesting use of the words missing or disappeared. Missing obviously connotes to people who have crossed the border and gone missing due to militancy. Whereas the word disappeared, it has an agent in the passive who was behind the disappearance. So missing becomes the more current usage of the word. But the women, the kin of these disappeared people, live in continuous uncertainty and trauma. They're expected to maintain a very ordinary and low-key life, almost always in perpetual mourning for their partners. A half-widow also cannot qualify for remarriage or usually any governmental welfare programs. There are enormous legal constraints for that category of women. As I said before, by the Indian legal system, the waiting for the missing person is a period of 7 years, after which the woman can choose to remarry. But statistically, it has been seen that most women, after that long wait, choose not to marry, and also perhaps in the patriarchal culture, that option is not always viable. Atharsia's work particularly focuses on the women's activism that has come through the disappeared people demanding answers and asking questions. And she talks about this group of people, the APDP, Association of Parents of Disappeared People, an all-women organization that was founded by Parveena Ahangar in 1994, whose son also went missing. And it has been recorded that between 8,000 and 10,000 Kashmiri men missing since the conflict, and the numbers keep rising, have been reported by the APDP. Women who are related to these missing men, they could be brothers or husbands or any other family kin, assemble in silent protest, much like the dharna sittings that the Shaheenbagh women did, on 10th of every month in Srinagar, and they hold images or posters demanding answers, grieving, remembering, but not forgetting. And this keeps happening. So this organization has been extremely significant to make this issue of the disappearance of people in Kashmir a larger visible national and even an international matter. It also shows how a collective resistance through gathering and mourning and sitting has been happening. Insha Malik's book, and this is a recent book, Muslim Women, Agency and Resistance, The Case of Kashmir, also raises an important question about agency in Kashmiri women and argues that Kashmiri women are denied political agency even if they're being consistently political and have a certain voice amidst the sexual violence and trauma inflicted on them. Malik especially reminds us that the history of Kashmiri women's resistance as political subjects and partakers into the struggle gets faded or often forgotten when they have voiced their self-determination and autonomy and placed themselves in the movement. Malik corrects this idea of the voiceless Kashmiri women through her work. While this is extremely important, Kashmiri women, so I'm looking at the different manifestations of the representation that women in the conflict zone have. And still, it seems that Kashmiri women are locked into two structures of representation. On the one hand, we see an exoticization of them as the other, this very sanitized image. And then on the other side, we have clearly protests and resistance that have been noted, and yet we don't find them in a certain kind of discussion or currency, apart from obviously academic and activist work going on. But through the last few years, and again, I'm sorry, I cannot show you these images. If we look at media, newspaper, representations of photographic collections of women in the conflict zone, usually what they have one thing in common is that the photographs are of grieving and mourning women. And that has been historically and socially accepted as the gendered affect and emotion of women in conflict zones. And I'm not trying to downplay the role of mourning or grieving that has a very significant place as seen through the different manifestations of the half widows or the sit-in protest or the mourning figures. There's this whole body of literature and discourse on how mourning and social rituals of grieving itself are acts of resistance and of reflection. So there is activism in mourning also. But what I'm trying to argue here is that between the two binaries, there is something beyond in the everydayness of women in a conflict zone like Kashmir. I want to turn to the haunting quotidian of women's experiences beyond these two binaries. Rajeshwari Sundarajan argues, and I'm quoting her here, women's agency can neither be viewed as an abstraction nor celebrated as an unqualified good. Agency is never to be found in some pure state of violation or action, but is complexly imbricated within various structures. It is the unsung civilian women who daily struggle to sustain their families and themselves within the conflict zone and the daily onslaught of terror in their lives. So resistance often gets equated to an oppositional act. But for the Kashmiri women, we also need to pay closer attention to what, and I'm quoting here from another very recent book called Terror and Survival, which focuses on the Northeast, but the similar structures are very much present here. And the writer Amrita Ghosh talks about the ordinary ways in which subjects survive and endure these states of conditions of abandonment. Thus, what happens to resistance and agency of subjects living under covert or overt violence is their survival. Hence, agency is manifested in manifold ways in the spaces of exception. Stellan Windhagen and Anna Johansson's work on everyday resistance also highlights that agency is historically tangled with everyday power and contingent due to changing context. They call it resistance studies and show how agency can be located in the practice of the everyday, much like Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday. James Scott, and here I use his coining of infrapolitics. In 1985, he foregrounds a different kind of resistance which doesn't involve visible rebellion, subversion, or riots, or protest. And he calls it infrapolitics that recognizes the everyday ordinary lives of subalterns into political matters. Such infrapolitics is also integrated into social life of Kashmiri women as a part of carving out normality within extremely aberrant conditions of conflicts. The attempting to go out in a curfew, going about in a day, its rituals, its practices are all haunting reminders of the everyday lives embodied and assimilated by Kashmiri women in a zone that is anything but normal. These acts deviate from hegemonic understandings of agency to achieve that tend to achieve non-recognition. The affect of combating the everyday within the state mechanisms of control and silencing is also one of resilience. So I come to this act of resilience as a form of resistance here. Thus, we need non-essentialist modes or understandings of resistance and agency when it comes to women, Kashmiri women in the conflict zone. One that allows a more nuanced understanding of situational networks through which women survive, endure, and cope through violence. In the third part now, what I will do is try to think about why I have chosen these two incidents spanning the 6 months from August 2000, actually less than 6 months, August 2019 to December and beyond, when the movements took further shape. And I want to also briefly talk about how the Shaheenbagh movement was perceived by the media and lots of academics who were writing about it, and hence why I call this a dialectic of gendered protest. The Shaheenbagh protests are called, and I quote here, awakening of Muslim women, shattering of the stereotype about Muslim women. It has given Muslim women a voice and agency that was previously lacking, and this is Professor Zoya Hassan. It has also shattered stereotypes of Muslim women that they're uneducated, burqa-clad with no voice. And these are the different voices that I'm articulating that summed up the movement. Another article states, no one would have expected such significant and sustained participation of Muslim women who led from the front. Professor Hassan also states, quoting, they are heavily overrepresented among the poor, they lack mobility and employment, yet they have remained invisible in public policy and political processes. However, the high visibility of Muslim women in this movement, Shaheenbagh movement, should have a positive impact on their status and should contribute to the greater concern being given to their education, livelihood. End quote. Elsewhere, another article, Srimati Ghoshal talks about the Shaheenbagh protest. I'm quoting her. They have broken stereotypes, set headfirst into uncharted territory, and gifted this nation its first public imagination of politically powerful Muslim women since Razia Sultana, end quote. And obviously it harkens back to the 13th century leader of the Indian subcontinent, the Sultanate at that time, the Delhi Sultanate, Razia Sultana. And the idea is that since then till now, it's only the Shaheenbagh Muslim women who have gained a certain kind of political agency. Alka Kurian locates the Shaheenbagh movement, and I found this absolutely fascinating, in an inclusive activism. What she calls is a part of a significant fourth wave of feminism. And I think that is really worthwhile in noting her work in how she locates the three waves of feminism in the US and talks about a larger, more international fourth wave of feminism and puts Shaheenbagh protests in it. Yet, all of these representations and narratives of the Shaheenbagh protests They're rightly deserved. Shaheenbagh is this very dynamic movement that happened, that changed a lot in the last few months. It rightly deserves accolades for gaining and highlighting Muslim women pioneering the face of resistance. But the Kashmiri women's protests are almost at an erasure or forgotten. They don't really get that kind of space, apart from obviously academic work and some other spaces, alternative spaces. The APDP silent protests are going on for years. The women who had registered and reported the Kunal Poshpora event are still resisting the legal structures and demanding answers, but it doesn't often act as a reminder of a protest against the state brutalities. Shaheenbagh becomes an extremely important moment and a movement where previously inactive social groups come together in this collective of politicized resistance. Yet the gender protests in India cannot current in the last 1 year or so. And again, gender protests are not just these two. I choose to focus on them because I thought that they're so close to each other, and yet the manifestation of representation is so different. But there obviously has been, from 70s and 80s and so on, a long history of gender movements in India. So I am arguing that gender protest currently cannot be discussed without taking into account the multiple ways of understanding resistance agency, and that protests are rooted in different material conditions. We're at a moment in the Indian history and democracy when such possibilities and a dynamism leads to daily lived evidence that women are carrying an alternative women vision of the state. Perhaps a classic reminder of Spivak's subaltern women, and the subaltern speak. The women of Shaheenbagh are saying they have, and they're speaking, and that they have agency. And in Kashmir, the gendered subaltern women have been speaking, if only we do not romanticize that it is the first time. Thank you.